past, Clinton County, Missouri was the western edge of the United States. Situated between two emerging cities, Kansas City and St. Joseph, Clinton County benefited from their growth. The Pony Express, the Gold Rush, and Western migration brought people through the county, but the population that settled here put it on the map. Plattsburg became the beef capital of the world. Lathrop was the major supplier of mules for the Boer Wars and World War I. 5 railroads crisscrossed the county, and the nation's first north-south highway ran through Cameron, Plattsburg, and Trimble on its way to Kansas City. Clinton County was home to David Rice Atchison, president for a day, James Harvey Birch, Missouri Supreme Court judge, Willis J. Wynn, president of the Cleveland Federal Reserve, and James Marshall, early leader of the Manhattan Project. Here are more family histories of Clinton County.
Hi, my name is Melissa Stutzman, and I am going to give a little bit of my family history for Clinton County. The Transue family actually moved here. My great grandfather Abraham moved here with his wife Elizabeth Butts. Abraham was actually born in Philadelphia in 1788. He had 6 children. Him and his wife moved to Canton, Ohio first because that was part of the Louisiana Purchase, and since they were French, a lot of the French people who had made it to Philadelphia were traveling to Canton, and that was in 1829. And he had 2 children there, Lavinius and Susan. And that's when they decided after several years, well, it was 1840 actually, that they meandered to Clinton County. And Susan died at 26, and she is buried on the Transue home place with Abraham and his wife Susan. Lavinius, however, well, they actually purchased land in 1840. The settlement here in Clinton County was 1833, so it was right after Clinton County had been settled that they moved here in 1840. It was out on 272nd Street and 33, which the Smith Fork Creek is where their land is, or was, and Abraham put up a lumber mill and a grain mill, and people would come for, well, of course Missouri was barely settled, you know, and from all over, and spend the night to get their grain, you know, ground. And they would be in wagons, and they'd bring enough food for a couple of days, and they'd just camp out and get their grain, you know, ground and everything, and go back home, as well as, you know, people getting their lumber milled. He had 80 acres there on that property on the Smith Fork Creek. And Lavinius, his son, married Martha Sarah Kearns in 1858. And they are both buried, Martha and Lavinius are both buried at the log church. And Lavinius was quite the guy. He was a school teacher, and they both attended the log church, which was a Christian church. And he also was a truck farmer. He used to grow vegetables and grow plants and bring them in to Plattsburg and sell them. And also a school teacher and taught Sunday school. And he married Martha Sarah Kearns in 1858. She was actually his second wife. His first wife was Polly. She died after having 3 children. She died very young, and then he married Martha, who was widowed, who had 1 child from before, and they had, oh my gosh, 12 children. And so Yes. The really ironic thing that I think is kind of neat, well, I don't know if you think it would be neat or not, but his tombstone at the log church is huge, and both wives are buried on both sides of it. And you know, back in those days, women just had babies until they died. You know, not from childbirth necessarily, but from exhaustion. And then men would remarry and they'd have 10 more. You know, and that's why it's so hard for families to do a lot of genealogy, because there's so many branches, so many branches. One of the 12 children was George Wyatt, which was my great-grandfather, and he married a Martha Jane Gordon, which we knew as Grandma Jenny. And they resided in the Keystone area northeast of where Abraham settled, up around Turney. And she was a school teacher, and that is her school bell that I brought in here. And I knew she was a school teacher, and that was her school bell that had been handed down in the family. It's not worth that much to anyone else but me. And she loved being a teacher. And they belonged to the log church also, and she taught Sunday school there. And then after she divorced my grandfather George for reasons that none of the family knows why, she moved with all of her children, which they had 5 children, 1 girl and 4 boys, moved closer to Plattsburg, and she joined the First Christian Church down here. And that was just a really odd thing, because no one knows in the family why. Because in those days, women did not get divorced without the husband's permission. And so nobody knows why. I tried to find out where he went. I couldn't find out much information on him, other than he went and resided with the family over in the Keystone Turney area, and just never remarried, I guess. I couldn't find any information on him, but was just kind of a loner. So that was a family mystery that we'll probably never uncover, which is okay. But I found out a lot of information, more details about my family when I joined the DAR. And of course, you have to trace your lineage back to the Revolutionary War. And in fact, the first Abraham, the fourth, had 7 sons who fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, I don't know if that was from 2 wives or 1 wife, but 7 sons out of 1 family. And that was, to me, quite interesting. But the research of what people did, I found out more details. I heard stories growing up, you know, from my grandparents. Okay, and Grandpa George, back to Grandpa George, my great-grandpa, he was the son of Lavinius. He sidelined as a peanut roasting and popcorn person, but he was a farmer. And he went to all the Chautauqua events, and that was kind of interesting, because I kind of knew about that from one of his sons, which was my grandfather. And since my mother died when I was born, and my grandparents, her parents, got custody of me, I heard a lot of stories that my mother probably heard, that if she had lived, I might not have heard or been passed down to me. But I heard all the stories, except for the one about Grandpa George and the divorce. I just know that my granddad that raised me never talked about Grandpa George very much. His name was, but he always talked about his mother, Jenny. And I do have one memory of her. She died when I was 2, and she came out to the sandbox up at our home here on South Birch Avenue, and was playing peekaboo with me, and that's the only memory that I have, and I have a few pictures of her. Okay, their son Elmer Sturgis, which was George and Martha's son. Him and his wife, Virgie, both farm property off of J Highway, south of Plattsburg. And they moved to South Birch Avenue over by the old city park when my mother was only 8. That was in 1941. And then when she died in 1951, they, got legal custody of me. And in the process of doing the research for DAR, the DAR is very, very strict. You can't just say, well, so-and-so was my great-grandfather. You have got to have all the documentation. And you have got to have birth certificates. And you've got to have, they're really, really particular. It's worth getting into than any college sorority you could ever imagine. And it was so odd because the Stutzman side of my family, my dad's side, I figured they would be the ones that they are the type of people that would fight in the Revolutionary War. I had no idea it would be the Transue family because they were such opposite ends of the spectrum politically that I thought it would be the Stutzmans, but no, they were all pacifists. They were actually German that kind of were in the group of Mennonites, believe it or not. And the Transues were the ones that were the patriots, which really shocked me a little bit. But getting into it was very interesting because I was having some problems making some links. And the state researcher actually started helping our chapter researcher. She got so involved in the Transue family that she didn't want to quit, and she called me and she said, this family is so interesting, Melissa. She said, I have found out so much information, and it was really great because she turned all that information over to me and I got to read it, to prove that my heritage did link back to the Revolutionary War. But it was quite interesting. I grew up around here too, and the more I research about, like I said, 12 children and all the branches, there are Transues buried in, I think, in every single old cemetery around here. I have pulled up more and more people. I didn't even know these cemeteries existed, and I've been all over Clinton County. So my goal is to go out and find some of those graves of people. The Transue family was many, 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 many people around. And sadly, the 1881 history that was published for Clinton County, that featured the people and their ancestry that paid for that book. And I know Helen Russell and I talked about that one time. Her family, she has had lineage, here too, and her family wasn't in there. There's one mention of, I believe it's Lavinius being a school teacher, and that's all. But it has been very interesting journey for me. I knew that I had ancestry here, but I didn't realize just how far and how deep and how many Transues, resided and got married and branched out to Easton. I found out relatives that I didn't even know I was related to. And most of them I was glad. Most I was really glad. One was a really, really good friend. In fact, when I was trying to find more information about George and him, my grandma Jenny divorcing him and all the kids went with her, and that he resided someplace over around Shoal Creek. Well, I have a good friend, Grace Daniels, who is president of the Turney Historical Society. And I thought, Shoal Creek, and that's kind of over there by where she lives. So I called her one day and I said, Grace, I said, I am looking, I've got some questions that maybe you might help me answer. I said, was there any kind of an inn or a tenement house where people lived in if they were single back in the day? And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I explained the situation about my grandfather, and she said, well, people took people in back in those days. She said, my dad took in a man that had no place to go, he had no family, and he stayed with us until he died. So chances are your grandfather probably was living over here with someone who took him in. She said, what was his name? And I told her, and she said, well, we had an uncle that was Uncle such and such Transue. And so I started looking down the family tree, and it was him. So see, I found out it was her uncle. I found out I'm related to a good friend. So truth be known, if all of us did that, we would probably find out. We're related to a lot of people. But it's been quite a journey. I've enjoyed it. I'm proud to be from Clinton County. And it has a lot of rich old heritage here.